And hello. Before I get into a lesson for today, let me give you a quick update on Arlene's dad, John Dallas. He's now in Kilbride Hospice, which is right there beside Hare Myers Hospital. Arlene and her sisters are now again able to visit. He's no longer coughing. He's got an IV drip in, giving him fluids. They're still not giving us any hope, but they are saying that he has a strong heart. So we are hoping and praying, and we ask you to do the same, that he might turn the corner and beat this virus. But he's very alert and aware of the girls when they're there, and apparently was sitting up last night. And doing a lot better. So we're just hoping it's not just a rally for a drop, but that he is doing better. Arlene continues in self-isolation, particularly because she's exposed to COVID-19 every time she goes to see him. But as far as her own symptoms, she's much better. I don't really think she's had COVID-19. I think it's been a seasonal illness, although it could have been a mild case of coronavirus. We simply do not know. I continue, though, to be very well. I'm doing the social distancing and all that, and so I'm fine as well. So keep everybody that you can think of that's affected by this in your prayers. Although we are continuing in lockdown, it is Easter Sunday. But such a different Easter, isn't it? We usually spend Easter with Scott and Rochelle, or they with us. And we were looking forward to spending some time on Easter this year with Joe. First Easter with a grandson. But this virus is deadly. I think Arlene's dad catching it and his struggles have really driven that home to us. It's highly contagious. So we will not be seeing them, obviously. I did take this photo of the daffodils at the building just over a week ago when I was opening the building for Lifeways. I thought you might want to see it because it's such a beautiful display this year that's there. So it's grand that God provides all this beauty around us, and we see spring coming in. By the way, I'm not going to have to open up the building, at least for the next few weeks, for Lifeways. They've decided to go to online training, and I thought that was a good move. So Arlene will be involved in that in a week or so. By the way, one more thing before the lesson. There is a new book that's come out this week by John Piper. If you're familiar with John Piper, if you're not familiar with him, he is what's known as a Christian writer. He has written a book called Coronavirus and Christ. It's a free download in a digital format, as well as a free audiobook to download. I've downloaded various formats as well as the audiobook, and I've started listening to it, and so far I've really enjoyed it. It's really been a good book. If you are interested in getting your own copy of this, contact me. I'll send you the details of how to download it. I thought in our lesson for today that we would look at the resurrection of Jesus. It is Easter Sunday, and I realize that we don't remember his resurrection once a year, but we remember his resurrection each Sunday when we come together. But our thoughts at this time of year are turned towards those events. And it is April. It is probably around the right date that all this happened. So I thought in our lesson today, we look from Luke 24. And what I'm wanting to do is look at, there's three different scenarios there, and look at each of those three incidents. So not in as much detail as I would like, but at the same time, hopefully it'll be enough to give us something that we can think about. Again, we'll start by looking at the when all this took place. This is the same slide I had up last week. We're in that last week of Jesus' life. I believe it was in 30 AD. It happened in April, the Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So that's where we are. And of course, his ascension didn't take place for another 40 days after the resurrection. So it'll take place in May. So we're on that last, that Sunday, a week after the triumphal entry that we looked at in our last lesson. So what we're going to be looking at this week in particular is on the Thursday, of course, we had Jesus' trial. Like I believe it was on Thursday. You can believe it on Friday. It doesn't matter really. But if it was on a Thursday, Jesus' trial, his crucifixion, his burial, of course, that evening is when Passover would have begun, because their days started at 6 p.m. And as I said in our last lesson, I really think that is the reason that we get these dates sort of mixed up, because we think in the terms that we have of days through the week. If I've got it correct, Friday, of course, is the Passover. That was the day as well that the tomb was sealed and guarded. Of course, Friday evening, which would have been, according to Jewish reckoning, the beginning of Sabbath, of Shabbat. Saturday, of course, was the Sabbath day. And then it says, as we're going to read, very early on Sunday morning, we have the resurrection and also the appearances that took place. So that's what we're going to be sort of looking at in this lesson here. So, beginning of Luke 24, I'm not going to read all the chapter, but I do want to look at these first 8 verses, as I think this is one of my favorite parts of Scripture. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the 3rd day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. So it's early on Sunday morning. I get the impression it was probably a bit darker than this picture depicts it. But early on Sunday morning, the women went to the tomb to complete the embalming of Jesus' body. But when they got there, they found the stone was already rolled away. Now, obviously, this would have caused some concern. What's happened? Where's the guards? Has there been grave robbers? What has caused all this to happen? And when they entered into the tomb, they found that the body was gone. Now they're wondering about this, and while they were wondering about it, 2 men in bright clothes, bright as lightning, the text says, appeared beside them. The women were frightened. I think we could say they were scared out of their wits. And I think we can relate some to that. You know, if we were in a cemetery even, and we saw a grave opened, and we were looking at it, wondering what's happened, and then suddenly, in fact, not only open, but empty, right? But suddenly, 2 people show up right beside us. We didn't see them arrive. I think we'd have been scared too. The men asked them, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? Don't you just like that?" What are they saying? They're saying he's not here. He has risen. Jesus is not dead. He's alive. And by the way, remember he told you this while he was still with you in Galilee. When reminded, they remembered that Jesus had said this. Perhaps they hadn't understood what he'd been at the time, so what he said maybe didn't lodge in their memory. But now they remember. Yeah, Jesus did say after 3 days he would rise again. When they went back into the city to where the 11 were, they told them what they had seen and what had happened. Although they didn't believe them, Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Now, in John's recording of this, John tells us that he ran along with Peter to the tomb. In fact, he beat Peter to the tomb. It's thought that John was probably younger. That may be the reason why. But he got to the tomb first, but he didn't go in. But when Peter got there, Peter went in. And they saw the strips of linen lying by themselves. And they left, wondering what had happened. Think about it. No body, but the wrappings have been left. Some have even been folded up. How's that happened? In fact, in John's description of it, he says when he saw the wrappings, the Greek words are, it's as if the body had sort of lifted out of it, because they were still right in place where they should have been. Just to give you a little bit of what this looks like today, because I've been doing that in these lessons. Later, there was a church building built over the site of Jesus' tomb, as well as the site of Golgotha, where he was crucified. This is referred to as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre today. Sadly, it's difficult to really get a feel for what happened when you go in. I'll show you some pictures from inside, but the only word I can think of is it's gaudy. It's really not, to me, conducive to give you an impression of what happened when Jesus was crucified and buried and resurrected. This church, by the way, is today run by several different religious groups. They each have parts inside it, and that they really can't get along is seen in the existence of the ladder below that window on the right, you see, in the picture there. It's been there since the 1800s. Somebody apparently was using it, left it, and nobody claims it, so it's still there today. So the people, they can't get along well enough for somebody to go out and get that ladder. I bet you it's rotten today. But anyway, when you go in, you can ascend up some stairs and go to the top of what would have been Golgotha. And yes, I found that very gaudy, not very useful. But having said that, if you look in the picture there, you can see that some of the stone is still left exposed, and where the lady is under the table there, you can reach down. There's an opening, and you can touch the actual stone there. I did that when I was there. So, but you can visit that. Now, the sepulcher they have there, and it very well could be the right spot, but they have built a sort of a shrine over it. And they say that this is where the tomb which belonged to Joseph of Arimathea was. It very well could be right. But you can go into it, and you can see people on the right hand of the picture there going in. The day that we were there in January of 2018, we arrived early enough, there weren't any queues, so we were able to go in. You're not allowed to photograph inside, but that's what it looks like. I had my camera around my neck and just pressed the shutter. Again, it's gaudy inside. Again, you can't get really a feel of this as being the tomb of Jesus. What was useful for me, though, was just right around the corner from that tomb, there are some first century graves which have been preserved, and they give you a better visualization of what Jesus' tomb would have looked like. And it probably been something like this. And when you go inside this particular tomb, we went inside, and there are, as you notice, there's no lighting, but one of the people in our group you used their phone to illuminate it for me so I can take a picture. And this particular tomb has two places for bodies inside it. But if you really want to get a feel for what a tomb in a garden would have looked like, there is what they call the garden tomb in Jerusalem. While many over the years have thought that this was Jesus' tomb, archaeology has revealed that it dates from about 800 years earlier. Keep in mind that Joseph's tomb was a new tomb, not a renovated one. So this probably is not it, but it is a tomb set in a garden. So you really get the feel for probably what it would have been like if we had been one of the women who visited the tomb. By the way, you go inside this particular tomb, there's a place for a body on the right as well as one on the left. The guide, when we were there in November, showed that this is probably similar to what it would have been like. You can see the places where the heads would have been, and that this type of tomb could have held 3 bodies. So they say this is very similar to what it would have been like. So the women go there. Peter's gone there. We know from John's gospel, John's gone there. Of course, we also have the resurrection appearances to Mary, but to the women first, and then to Mary as well, Mary Magdalene. And so Jesus is alive. But the next appearance that Luke records begins in verse 13. It's two disciples who were on their way home from the Passover, and they lived in Emmaus. So they're walking to Emmaus. It's about 7 miles from Jerusalem. One we find out from the text there, his name is Cleopas. The other is not given a name. We don't know who that was. But think about it, 7 to 7.5 miles from Jerusalem to Emmaus, about 2.5 hour walk thereabouts. It doesn't appear that they were really really rushing. They were taking their time, and it would have been downhill. I did find this map that suggests where Emmaus may have been, although from what I've been able to find out, that we don't know precisely where the village was located. But some think it was just there, just to the northwest of Jerusalem. If that's correct, the area would have been less wilderness than our photos that I'm using to illustrate this lesson depict. This is what the area just to the northwest of Jerusalem looks like. You can see it's a lot greener than the area to the east of Jerusalem. Mount of Olives keeps rainfall from going over to the east. This side, though, does get rainfall. But again, this is another picture looking at some of the hillsides, and you can see all the trees. They get at least some rainfall in this particular area. But as they're walking, they're discussing what's happened. And a third man joins them. Now, we can tell who it is from the picture we have, can't we? And in fact, the text tells us who it is. But they say, and the text also tells us they didn't recognize Jesus, that they were kept from recognizing him. Well, he asked them, "What are you talking about?" They then explained to them about Jesus' execution. Verse 18, beginning there, one of them named Cleopas asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there these days?" "What things?" he asked, as if he really didn't know. But he's getting them to tell him, isn't he? "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. But what's more, it's the third day since all this took place." Can't you just sort of hear the disappointment in their description? We'd hoped that he was the Messiah, and that seems to be what they're saying there. But then also they mentioned that third day, and they go on basically saying, "But something strange has happened." Verse 22, "In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus." They don't know what's happened, and they're pondering this as they're walking along, explaining it to who they think is a stranger. Jesus then begins to explain what the prophets had said about the Messiah. And text tells us, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Wouldn't you have loved to know all that Jesus pointed out to them that day? Of course, we've got the scriptures, don't we? And hopefully we've been able to see some of them. And when we read them, hopefully we recognize him. But would you just have loved to have been there, to have heard what he said about himself, beginning with Moses, probably talking about the prophet that Moses talked about, going through the prophets, undoubtedly Isaiah as well as others, explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Wonderful. Well, they got to the village. It's only a couple of hours' walk. They arrived at the village, and it was getting late, so they invited Jesus to come home with them. And when they got home, they set out a meal. They were very hospitable followers of Jesus. They got out a meal, and the text tells us that Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and they recognized him. And then he disappeared. They said, it was said that it was in the breaking of bread, when he broke the bread and gave thanks, that they recognized, at least their eyes were opened, that this was Jesus himself. They asked each other, verse 32, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? Well, can you imagine sitting there eating a meal and the person who's giving thanks, when you recognize who he is, literally disappears from in front of you? That would have been amazing. Well, what do? Well, you get back to Jerusalem, don't you? And they returned at once, the text tells us, to Jerusalem. And I'm sure that trip, even though it's uphill, was a whole lot quicker than the journey home was. I'm sure that they were rushing. When they got to Jerusalem, they found, the text says they found the 11, the others assembled together, and told them what had happened. Of course, we know from John's account that actually Thomas isn't there, although they're referred to as the 11. They already knew, though, that Jesus had risen, because he'd also appeared to Peter. And then, while they're discussing all this, verse 36, while they're talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." Don't you love it? They're talking about Jesus not being dead, and suddenly he's there. John tells us that the room was locked, and yet he appeared before them. Now, there was one thing we learned from this. It was more than just the 10 initially, 11 the next week, that were together. That we know that at least Cleopas and his friend are there, and the indication is there's more that are gathered together, that are probably consoling each other. Of course, also talking about the fact that people have seen Jesus alive. Jesus then, verse 37, they were startled and frightened. I mean, wouldn't we be if somebody appeared in a locked room? Totally started frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I, myself. Touch me and see. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones, as you see I have." And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. Verse 41, and while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Jeff, here anything to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. He said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that was written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." By the way, that's the entirety of the Old Testament scriptures. Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, this is what was written. The Messiah would suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you've been clothed with power from on high. And he may have been condensing some things that went on there in the upper room, or the room they were in that night, with the incidents just before he was resurrected. At the beginning of Acts, rather before he ascended, At the beginning of Acts, Luke records that Jesus presented himself to the apostles alive after his suffering by many convincing proofs, by being seen by them for 40 days. So there's a 40-day period that this appearing on the Sunday following his crucifixion. That Sunday, his resurrected was beginning of 40 days of Jesus appearing to his disciples and to his apostles. He wasn't with them the entire time. He tends to, as one writer put it, be popping in and out. It very well could be that. We know that part of this time was spent teaching them further about God's kingdom. But part of this, the reason for this extended period of appearing to them, I believe, was to convince them that he really was alive. He wanted to remove all doubts from their minds. Well, what is there in this chapter that we can learn? I think the one thing that really should be coming out is that Jesus truly did not stay dead. The tomb truly was empty. There were too many witnesses that he was alive. If the tomb hadn't been empty, by the way, don't you think the Jewish authorities would have opened it to show people the decaying body to prove the apostles wrong? I mean, they're very upset when he's preaching, when they're preaching that Jesus is alive, that he resurrected. I believe the Jewish authorities also knew that it was empty. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But this had been written hundreds of years earlier in the prophets. Sometimes we wonder, what's the point of the Old Testament? Notice Jesus said the entirety of the Old Testament he fulfilled. That's why the Old Testament is important. That's why we need to be studying it as well. And by the way, the first Christians met together, that's the only scriptures they had for many years, was the Old Testament. And they read it and they knew it as well. What should this tell us, though? I think it should tell us the same thing it told them. Jesus is the Messiah. He undoubtedly is the Messiah, the one who came to die for our sins. And through him, we can have forgiveness. As Peter pointed out on the day of Pentecost, this was God's plan for the salvation of all. Yes, we're in lockdown. During this week, spend some time with God. That's one thing we have time to do. Be praying that this crisis will be over soon with little loss of life. Be praying for anybody we know who has the virus. And again, I ask you to continue praying for my father-in-law. Pray for him. Keep reading and studying the Bible. We've got time to do that if we're locked down at home. Next week, I'm planning that our lesson will be from Luke chapter 7 again. I wanted to look at a particular incident that's in Luke chapter 7. Of course, there are online lessons and studies, and these continue to be popular. We're offering these through the British Bible School. With BBS, we'll have a live message on YouTube at 11 o'clock today on Sunday the 10th. That can be accessed if you can't be there at 11 o'clock. That can be accessed from the BBS YouTube channel. You can find a link to that on their on the BBS website without any problem. Of course, there's BBS classes that are going on throughout the week. You can find not only the links but also the list of them on the British Bible School website, on the news and events page, and on the online events page of that page. So, and you really need to access it through that page. You can click on the icon there, and it will take you right into them. We've had to password the classes because of the abuse that some are doing Zoom bombing, and we had that happen week before last to us, and so YouTube Zoom is now requiring us to password them, but Patty embeds the password on the link on the web page, so you can access it from there. Stay safe. Continue the social distancing. That is so very, very important. And exercise daily, that's important as well. Who knows, you may get addicted to it. I've been doing it for over a year and a half now, and it's doing me loads of good. And of course, when we can meet again, I so much look forward to seeing each one of you. But do stay safe. Until we meet again, I pray that God will hold you in his hand.